Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions today, please type them into the Q&A icon located at the bottom toolbar. We will answer them at the end of each presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the May 10th edition of Crop Talk. With this week's Crop Talk, we've had quite a few areas where producers are getting in the field, so I thought I would update on seeding progress. I was going to give kind of a general update on seeding progress, and then I was going to break it down into our regions and just talk a little bit about as to how the different regions are doing, as weather conditions are a little bit different for everybody, and progress is different in some of the areas. So I thought I'd do that. Talk a little bit about other things that might be happening in the field, and our crop scouting panel as well is here today. And we've had a few questions come in over the past week, and figured we'd run it by the panel and get those answers for the people. So with that, I'm going to start the presentation off with a chart that you're going to see probably quite a bit over the next little while, and it's our seeding progression chart for 2023. And the good part about it is it kind of gives us a comparison to the previous years as well. And you know, when you look at last year at this time, you know, very little seeding had been done yet. So, you know, definitely not a panic situation, you know, but we were talking just before the webinar started here that we are getting into the 10th of May already. So, you know, so we're into that second week already, and we would sure be nice to get the right amount of right weather so we could get out there and get crop in the ground. But you know, compared to last year, the first week after the first week of May, we were, you know, basically, you know, same kind of situation, very little crop in. But when you look at our 5-year average, you know, we should be in that 20%, or maybe getting to be a little bit better than 20% by now. So, it's amazing. We do have you know, some areas which are probably getting close to that. So it just depends on where you are right now and what your conditions are and your field conditions are as to whether you're into that 20% yet, or if you're just nicely getting going. So a chart I guess I always like to put up too, just to give us a kind of an understanding of where you need to be and crops you need to be looking at as we get farther into the month of May here. And when you look at the second week of May, and you know, really the only crop that is starting to, you know, get to be, you know, a little bit of a concern is peas. You know, we're still anywhere from, you know, 80-90% to 100% yield right now on the second week of May. So we really aren't going to drop off until we get to about the third week of May. So even though we still got some time to get those peas in the ground, and I've talked to some producers that are starting to get a little bit concerned if they don't have theirs in yet, and some guys that are maybe thinking about some other crops. But I think the big thing to remember is soil conditions right now are fairly good, where most producers I talk to are seeding into moisture, and the soil temperatures have warmed up a fair bit. So you know, I don't think it'll take long for some of those crops to get going. So, and then when you look at the rest of the crops, we've pretty much got, you know, all of this week and you know, beginning of next week before we need to start worrying about them breaking that 100% yield possibility. So good week and a half to 2 weeks before we need to be too concerned about any of the crops that we grow of larger number of acres on start to drop off a bit. So just some general comments as to where we are right now. Winter wheat in most areas is greening up pretty good right now, and looks pretty good actually. However, there's still some concerns about areas where we've had some excess moisture, some overland flooding, and some of those fields remain, the winter wheat crop still remains a bit underwater, and it's just a concern there as to how long it can handle that. And it's something where when you get that overland flooding, and then the water takes a longer time for it to get off the land, and in some areas it starts to pool just because there's not the drain. So in some of those areas we might lose some of that crop, but in general the winter wheat crop is looking pretty good throughout the province. Fields that needed fertilizer this spring, a lot of it that had to be done before the ground thawed was done, but there's still some areas that fertilizer is still needed to be put on. So producers are going to be anxious to get that on fairly quick here as we, as the crop is starting to green up and we start getting some warm conditions. That crop is going to jump fairly fast. In general, progress of seeding of cereal crops, it varies throughout the province. The weather over the past week definitely helped. There was a lot of days of warm conditions with some wind, and that dried out a fair bit of the soil. Areas to the southwest are probably most advanced right now with peas and wheat. And when I talk about the southwest, I talk largely in that area, kind of the Manitoba Saskatchewan border, where you get areas like Macaulay, Minnesota, down into that Melita Reston area. Some of those areas, some of the soil a little bit lighter, and just dries up faster, and some of those guys get out a little quicker. Also, you get down into that southern part of the southwest region in that Boissevain, Killarney area. Again, some of those areas dry up fairly quick, and producers can get going. But we did have some of those areas receive a fair bit of rainfall and snowfall in those last few events. So some of those areas are still waiting to get out on the land as well. So it does vary quite a bit as you travel throughout the province. Seeding conditions, as I mentioned, are pretty good. Most areas where producers are seeding into moisture, and as I mentioned, good soil temperatures. There was some rainfall, I guess yesterday or 2 days ago, and then last night again, and it is going to maybe slow some producers in some areas down for today, but I don't think it's going to take long for those areas to dry up again. I talked to some people, and they were anywhere from 3/10, 4/10, maybe the odd place might have got a ½ inch in some of those thunderstorms that went through, but it was I think definitely a welcome rain for the areas that got it. Also, see some sprayers out in the field as producers start to do some spring burn off, and I think that's one of the things with the soil temperatures warming up and the warm rains that we've been getting. I think we're going to see, or we have been seeing, a lot of those weeds, especially the winter annuals, going, and we're starting to see some of our annuals starting to come through, and definitely seeing kochia starting to come up. So, again, got to keep on top of those weeds. Early weed control is something that we talk about a fair bit on these webinars, and I think it's something we need to be always keeping our minds on. We're wanting to get the crop in, but don't fall too far behind in spraying as well. When I look, I thought I'd talked a bit about soil temperatures, so I went and brought up a few of the weather stations and seen what they were getting readings for soil temperatures. And look in Minnesota, we're looking, anywhere between 6 to 8 degrees. Carmen, 8 to 10, and then I mentioned that some of those areas where, guys have got maybe a little bit more seeding done, and you look in that Verdon area, we're looking at, a good, right around averaging around the 10 degrees already. So, that's Definitely shows where areas where guys are probably got a few more acres in, and is in those areas, because it just dries up a little bit faster, a little bit different soil type, and just can get out there and on the land a little bit quicker than the rest. Minimum germination temperatures for various crops. So this is good to know, because we're always concerned, and I think the biggest one is always is canola. We're always, worried about flea beetles, and flea beetles causing issues with our young plants. And I think one of the biggest recommendations over the last couple of years is to get it into warm soil so that it gets up growing fast and it doesn't spend too much time just sitting in the ground. And I think as we watch the soil temperatures, I think we're still not in the time period where it's great conditions to be seeding canola yet, and I don't think a lot of producers have put much canola in yet from who I've talked to, but we're still not quite in that 10 degrees for a lot of the areas, so I definitely would hold off there. Right in the area for your wheat cereal crops, there, and that's what's been going in. And some areas I've heard we're putting some flax in as well. So again, we're just kind of on the borderline for the flax going in. But again, different stations, different areas are going to have different soil temperatures. So it's just a good guideline to have in your mind when you're going out there to start changing a crop or going from cereals to oil seeds, to make sure that you're looking at fields that are in the right condition for planting. As I mentioned a little bit earlier on, there's some producers starting to get a little bit concerned about seeding peas. We're getting closer to that third week in May, and I guess what my comment on that is, we have really good, I shouldn't say we have really good conditions, but in most areas we have really good conditions for germination right now. So if you're still planning on growing peas, I would still look at them. We're still just going to be going into that third week of May, so we definitely got the time, and we're going to be dealing with some of the other questions regarding soybeans later on when we get into our panel. So with that, I kind of the general update for today, and then now some questions that have been coming up lately for the crop scouting panel, and I just wanted to bring on start with the questions here. So first one is for Dennis Lang, some comments on recent talk about seeding soybeans earlier. Every year seems to be more and more guys talking about seeding earlier, and I was wondering if you can make a comment, Dennis, about seeding soybeans and what people or producers should be looking at.
Yeah, thanks, Lionel. So this is something that we've come up with a few years back. Actually, we went back into the notes here, and this is probably going back to 2015, where my colleague Terry Bussett put this together to kind of summarize some of the things that we talked about when you're considering seeding soybeans. So there's things like calendar date, soil temperature, what the forecast is for the 24-hour period, and what your personal risk is in acres versus nerve, and how early you'd like to get in. Now, one of the things that's kind of maybe changed a little bit in the last couple of years is we're not looking at planting on May 1st anymore. Just with the last couple of years, we've been a little bit later. We are currently sitting at May 10th. So kind of the approaches that I take is, part of this risk that we always talk about when we're planting early, and we're talking like May 1st, is that if those soybeans do come out of the ground, they are quite susceptible to frost. And, the risk of frost goes up dramatically when you're planting early. But now once we're into that May 10th period, what I see a lot of producers doing, and I agree with their thought process on that, is we start getting into that mid-May period, which is the time that we should be planting soybeans. And kind of the recommendation I've been using with growers now is that, if your field conditions are suited for planting soybeans and your other fields are not, that would be probably the best time to start planting. Soil temperatures, as you said earlier, we like to see around 10 degrees Celsius for planting soybeans, and that would be like 10 degrees first thing in the morning. We're probably not quite there yet. We're probably somewhere between 5 to 10, depending on where you're at. The concern that some growers have is, I guess when you're looking at planting soybeans into cooler temperatures in that, below 10, those soybeans are going to take a lot longer to come up. So if soybeans are in the into that 8 to 10 degree range, the soil temp, and you're planting and it stays at that temperature for a couple of weeks, you could be looking at a good 2 weeks for them to come up. Whereas if you start getting into that above 10 degrees, into that 14 to 15 range, then that dramatically cuts that time down, and you're looking at maybe about a 7-day turnaround for those beans to come up. And what we saw last year is we were seeing planting kind of in that mid-May to the May long weekend where some growers started planting soybeans. And with the conditions warming up, a lot of those beans were up in 7 to 10 days, which really gave them a really good start. The concern that we've seen over the years with planting into really cool temperatures, and when you're looking at that 24-hour forecast, if it's looking cool and wet, you may want to delay a little bit just because that first 48 hours is really critical, where with the soil temperature and the water temperature there, just to get the seed off to a good start. But in general field conditions, the recommendation typically that I would like to use is if your field is ready to go and you're planting into good soil conditions, then I think you're good to start planting at this time of the year already, because we're in that time period where this is kind of the magic time period for planting soybeans, to get them in, to reduce the risk for frost in the fall as well. And as we saw last year too, crop insurance has changed the seeding deadlines now for soybeans in areas 1, 2, and 3. You can check that out on the Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporation website, but they have been pushed back a little bit. And that decision is a permanent decision that was made. And that was based on looking at all the data and looking at where the varieties have changed since they were initially, since the initial deadlines were put forward. And we've seen a lot earlier maturing varieties now. So it does give you a little bit of window. So long story short, planting in May, no matter where you are in Manitoba, if you pick the right variety and you pick the right maturity for your zone, that's what I mean by right variety, then planting in May, no problem. And in areas where you're planting into June, if you still pick the right variety in the wintertime for maturity, that first week of June should be fine for most planting. But yeah, if soil conditions are good, by all means, go ahead and start planting.
Hey, Dennis, you mentioned about like damp soil or wet soil. So big difference between soil type and moisture, and is that something that maybe has more of an effect on this as well?
Well, I think part of it right now is the growers that are able to plant right now have been planting into soil conditions, maybe a little sandier loam, just something that has more that has dried out a bit more. Some of the heavy clays down by the Emerson, Altona area there where there's nobody planting as of yet. But if your soil is a little sandier, typically those are the fields that maybe are going in right now. So.
Okay, and I had a producer that was asking me about was talking to me about growing peas, and he was wondering about if he's concerned about how long or when I should think about changing. And then we got talking, and he said, well, if I put them into the ground today, let's say, and the soil temperatures anywhere from 6 to 7, he said he was wondering how long is it going to take for them to come up out of the ground.
Well, field peas, as you said, are a little different than what soybeans are. Field peas will germinate at a little lower temperature. I wouldn't be, typically 10 days would be a good number to kind of look at. But even planting, to me, planting in May on a year like this, when everything's a little bit delayed, I think it's still a good option for you. So if you're planting peas, ideally get them in now if you can, if soil conditions are good. But still planting. We're only at the 10th here, so I would still feel comfortable planting after the May long weekend. And that would be kind of and even get into the end of May. But really, if soil conditions are suited now, get your peas in now and let them, and they're pretty frost tolerant. So I think you're good to go then. So.
Okay, and then one question that was just came in here is, does the cool soil conditions have any effect on the inoculant?
That's a good question. A lot of times with inoculant, it's more the moisture concerns with inoculant that's on the seed. Now, if you're putting a granular inoculant for soybeans, for example, that inoculant's available a little bit later, so that gives you a little bit extra protection. So not so much on the cooler temperatures, because the cooler soil temperatures, will maybe help with that a little bit. I think just keep it in a safe zone, I guess, if you want to call it that. I wouldn't be too concerned about the cooler temperatures initially, and soil temperatures are going to warm up in a hurry. It's amazing when we get things growing. We get the seed on the ground, things should be okay. But so cooler soil temperature, I wouldn't be too concerned with at this point. More so it's just usually excess moisture that seems to affect nodulation a lot more in spring if you're only using an on-seed inoculant, and that's why we always try to recommend for growers that have any concerns with that to maybe incorporate a granular inoculant into their cropping plants.
Okay, and just another one here regarding seedling diseases. Is there a temperature where they start to kind of, I guess, become a problem, or when it's cooler temperatures or soil temperatures, do they kind of stay dormant too?
Well, what I like to, if you are planting into cooler soil temps, using a fungicide seed treatment is going to give you a little bit of benefit to help battle those seedling diseases. And that's where I think you need to really, whether you're seeding peas or whether you're seeding soybeans, if you're planting into cooler soil temperatures, it's nice to have a fungicide seed treatment on there to help protect that seed a little bit more. There's a lot of factors that go into that, how the diseases will affect the seedling, how long it stays cool for, is it cool and damp? We saw some issues last year in dry beans actually with Rhizotodia root rot, which we haven't seen in a while in dry beans to a large extent. But in this case, it was a long-term history field of soybean or of dry beans and corn. And in parts of the field that were growers planted a little on the cooler side, there they had a lot more of an issue where with disease in that, whereas growers that waited a few more days on the dry beans and planted into a little warmer soil, those beans, took off a little bit more. So even though it was seed treated, sometimes certain pulses like dry beans are a little bit more sensitive. Peas are a lot tougher in that respect, and soybeans are as well. But still, use of a fungicide seed treatment is probably the best way to go if you're planting into cooler soils.
Yeah, and most seed was probably going to come that way anyways, I would think, right?
Well, it depends. Some growers still plant untreated pea seed yet. So soybeans soybeans, you can still make that decision. A lot of times when you're getting your seed treated, whether you want to go with that fungicide seed treatment or not, when they're today, a lot of times they treat, basically as they're being sent out. So.
Okay, good, great, thanks, Dennis. If there's something else that comes in, I'll bring you back.
Thanks.
Okay, for Kim, producer saying it's a drier spring in his area and he's going to be able to reclaim some unseeded land that has a large foxtail problem. He was looking for some advice for, I guess, A, what crop to plant, and B, what should he be doing before planting? And is there, I think, regarding the crop, is there a crop he could plant where he could have better control during the growing season too?
Yeah, thanks, Lionel. That's a good question. I know we've seen some terrible foxtail issues in the last couple of years, thanks to the drought that we had a few years ago. We've had one wet year behind us, or wetter year behind us, and now hopefully this, spring we're heading into, some decent moisture situations, but we still are going to have a bit of a hangover on that foxtail barley. That is a short-lived perennial plant, so some of those plants, got established in the dry area and the dry years, I guess, and they're still with us. So they won't be with us forever. Like I said, it is a short-lived perennial. The best crop to go into, though, like if you do have a foxtail problem and you're trying to get rid of it, if you're going into like an annual crop, would be wheat. There's a good system from Bayer. You would use Olympus pre-seed. It is only registered for wheat, and you would use that. It does broadleaves and grasses and does a really good job on foxtail barley, but it's got to be followed up in crop with another group 2, preferably something like a Vero or Velocity, which is a group 2, but there are other group 2s as well. You could do an Everest or Sierra or a Simplicity as well. So if you have that group 2 pre-seed and then a group 2 in crop, and so whenever that second group 2 is coming in crop, make sure you've got tank mix partners in there that are not group 2s. Again, something like the Velocity system is nice because you've got Infinity in there. So, you've got a group 27, a group 6, and if you throw in some MCPA or 2,4-D, depending on what other weeds you're going for, you've got 3 more groups in there. So that's great from a resistance management standpoint. So that would be my go-to, would be something like, would be wheat, just because you've got a really good system in there, but you have to follow up that Olympus with an in-crop group 2 spray as well. Beyond that, our next best herbicide option is probably Assure, which is quizalofop. So there are multiple brand names on that now, but so any of our broadleaf crops, it's a very safe chemistry, but it really only does well on the smaller seedlings. It won't do those big granddaddy plants, and so in that case, like, you will get some control if you were using any graminicide. My choice would be Assure. If you're going into something like a Liberty, like a canola, a Liberty Link canola, just make sure you're using lots and lots of water. Liberty does, or glufosinate. Again, there are other brands besides Liberty now, but I'll just talk about Liberty. But Liberty does a really good job. And the more water you have, the better. It does a good job on grasses, but again, more water, you'll get a better job on that. So minimum 10 gallons, but even if you've got a lot of foxtail, I'd be doing a 15-gallon spray on that. 15 gallons of water will you'll just get so much more coverage. And the same, if you went into a Roundup Ready canola, you might have, you would see some control there as well, but you've got to get good coverage on those foxtails. They are really hard to wet. They're small plants. There's not a lot of leaf area to them. They're very thin leaf, very upright, thin leaf, and they're also covered in hairs. So it's hard to wet. It's hard to get that plant wet so that it absorbs the herbicide. So again, like I said, there are some options out there, but in general, wheat would be my go-to if that's the first crop you're going to put on that land.
Okay. Right now, he was saying that on the last year's plants, it looks like it's starting to regrow from the mass or whatever was left from last year. So does it regrow from there, or is it always from seed?
Well, it's both, because it is a short-lived perennial. So you do have those clumps. It's a bunch grass, so it comes in all those clumps. So you'll have those clumps will be regrowing. And again, it is a short-lived perennial. So you're usually 2 to 5 years on those clumps. But there will be seedlings coming too. Those come from seed. And those are really, really hard to see. They are almost like needle-like, like they're so little and skinny. And very, very hard to see. The leaf is kind of rolled up almost too, like it's just almost like a little needles coming out of the ground. They're very hard to see, but there will be some coming from seed from last year. So it is both, but it's those big clumps that cause us the most grief, because they will be regrowing now, and they'll be, setting more seed and that type of thing. And those are the ones that cover a lot of ground in the field. Those ones take up a lot of space.
And the little seedlings would probably not be as competitive then, or?
Yeah, not as competitive. And so that's where something like Assure does really well on those seedlings, and maybe some of the younger clumps, like the smaller clumps, something like Assure, or quizalofop, any of the brands of quizalofop, they just wouldn't do a great job on those big plants. Those, like I say, those big granddaddy plants that have been there for a couple of years already, and they're getting quite big. You're not going to see good control on that, but you will see on the smaller plants and the new seedlings. But the Olympus system works great on the big plants. It does a really good job on the big plants again, but it's got to be followed up with a group 2 in the wheat for a post-emergent spray.
Okay, and then his last question was tillage. Does that just spread it around, or would that be an option?
Like it doesn't spread it around as much as like it would like something like a quack grass. And so again, the problem I guess with tillage is that it's a bunch grass. So when you pull up a lot of these clumps, it's hard, especially in the spring, because they don't have time to break down. So it's hard to get a nice seed bed after that, because some of these clumps can be pretty big. And so you'll pull them up. It doesn't have an underground root system. It is just a bunch grass. So it's going to just grow in all these bunches or all these clumps. So tillage can help, but if you've got a lot of it, it does make for a very rough seed bed. And it's got, you've also got, then you want to be getting a crop established. And one thing to look at too, when you're doing a lot of tillage in these areas, a lot of times where you're seeing the foxtail barley is because there's a salinity issue. And we know that, tillage and salinity don't mix, especially if you don't manage to get a crop established there, or you get a poor crop established there and you have, some bare ground showing, or a very thin crop. And then so you get that upward movement of water, up to the surface of the soil, and you get those salts keep coming back up to the surface. So it's the foxtail barley is a symptom that there's salinity present. And so we also need to make sure that if you are doing tillage, we've got a good possibility of getting a crop growing there. I mean, if it's, if a soil test would help, if you've got a soil test to actually measure those salinity levels. If they're high enough, even a crop like crop like you might end up having to go into some of like the forage grasses or something like that are much more saline tolerant. So just make sure you're setting yourself up for success on that piece of land where the foxtail barley is, because it's there for a reason. And it's there because, it likes a saline soil. So tillage can definitely make that worse. But if you feel, you will get, maybe that did used to have a crop on it at one point, just during the dry years, that kind of backed off because of the salinity. If you feel that you're able to get like something like a good competitive wheat crop established, then tillage can help, but it's just going to make that seed bed a bit lumpy if there's a lot of big clumps. That's my concern with that in the spring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we talked about this before, but we the last couple of years we've seen foxtail barley in areas where, like, throughout your whole field. So it's something that can spread, but it's easier to get control of when it's out in the major part of the field instead of these low areas or saline areas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have to have a plan for that saline area, because sometimes you're just never going to get a crop there, or never get a decent crop there. And if you don't have a decent competitive crop, and you're not using all that water, or you have upward movement of water to the soil surface through, evaporation, then, you're just bringing more and more salts back up to the surface. And that just makes the problem worse for the coming years.
Good. Okay. I think I've got another one for you here. There we go. So I had a crop scout send me some pictures, and I think these are ones that we talk about almost every year, but I thought it would be good just to give another reminder as to what these are and how concerned we should be about them.
Well, the one on the left, I'm thinking is that that's horsetail, or like equisetum. I just call it equisetum. There's lots of it. Sometimes it's called scouring rush. That one is really hard to get control of. It's actually not even really like a plant. It's more of like it's got spore. It's an ancient plant. The leaves, that's actually stem that you see there. The leaves are these tiny little things on there. It's very hard for it to absorb chemical. So I know lots of times things like glyphosate and glufosinate, like they'll blacken it up, but it just comes right back. That has an incredible underground root system. And so it's really hard to get rid of. Actually the best herbicide for that, believe it or not, even though that looks like a grass, it's not a grass at all, but MCPA. And I have heard, it's not on the label, but it is anything with Aralex in it, or haloxifin is the active ingredient, does a pretty good job as well. So that can get rid of it, but lots of times those are your horsetail is in an area of the field that's got a lot of underground water, And so it's just kind of, it tends to be in these areas in the field that it's tough to get rid of. And in certain crops, it is really hard to get rid of because, like I said, glyphosate and even glufosinate, really, they don't do much to it. They'll blacken it, but it just comes right back. I wouldn't be doing tillage in those areas. You can spread the rhizomes around, but there are rhizomes that go really, really deep. So even if you think you're going to dry it out with tillage, or, dry those rhizomes out, you won't, because those rhizomes can go really, really deep into the soil and it'll just keep coming back. So, and on the right side, we get calls every year about a couple of weeds. We get like pygmy flower, or pygmy weed, sorry, and then prairie candelabra. Both are very, very tiny weeds. Sometimes we see a lot of them early in the spring. They're very small weeds. They're tiny little weeds, and they have a very, very short life cycle. So it's quite concerning because sometimes you can see quite a carpet of both of those. Again, either the pygmy flower or the fairy candelabra. It's got other names as well. But they're both very, very small, and they don't really take anything away from yield. They're here and they're gone very, very quickly. They'll flower very quickly, but I know they are concerning because all of a sudden you see a mat of these green plants and they will cover the ground very quickly, but they're also gone very quickly. So it's not anything to worry about. They've never justified spraying anything. They're going to be gone in a week or two. Even they'll be gone already. They'll already be. Some of them might be close to flowering already, and then of course once they flower too, they're gone. So they're nothing to worry about. It's just again, it's something that we get calls on every year. We always see. Especially when there's a lot of them. Again, they can form a carpet, but it's not there for very long, so it's nothing to worry about.
Yeah, from what I've always seen of them, they're flowering now, and by the time you get out there to seed that field, they'll be gone already. So it's not a very bad weed, that's for sure.
Yeah.
With the horsetail, a lot of times I'll see it like even around trees, bluffs and stuff like that. But I guess that makes sense because there's probably a slough in that bluff or whatever. So
yeah, there's usually a reason why there's trees there, right? Because there's a water source. Even though we don't see something on the surface, there's usually like a high water table or underground water sources. And and I think that's yellow whitlow or yellow whitlow grass, I think, is the actual the picture on the right, and then also the fairy candelabra. Sorry, I think I forgot to say the actual name of that. Anyways, we see lots of them, and I think with some really warm days, they'll just pop up everywhere and then be gone again pretty quick. So.
The other place for horsetail, and when you get into areas where there's not a lot of trees, I see it a lot beside a lot of ditches and stuff where water's in the ditch, and then first, I don't know, 5 or 6 feet into the field, you'll see it.
Yeah. And again, there's probably, just again, there's water in that ditch. And so it's because there's water. We do, you guys, you do have to be careful with it, I guess, because you have to be careful if animals are ever eating it. There has been horses in particular are apparently quite sensitive to it. It can be quite toxic. So there is that if you do see it in pastures and things like that, or if you're taking any ditch hay or things like that, it's something to be aware of. They can only tolerate a small amount of it in their diet. But in field crops, like I've seen it totally choke out soybeans in areas of the field where near the bush and stuff, where it'll just be like, a quarter of an acre or even a tenth of an acre. It looks really bad, but if you look at it over the whole field, it's not a big area. Like and really in a lot of those areas, there's not a lot you can do about it. So you just kind of have to live with it. And in crops where you can use MCPA or any of the products that contain Aerolex, then you can kind of get better control on it then. But it's a kind of a perennial thing. It's just going to keep coming back because you're not changing what's happening below the soil with that water, where that water is.
Good. I thought maybe while I was asking you the questions, if you wanted to give another shout out for the Weed Seedling ID Day.
Yes. Oh, thanks very much. That is great. May 25th at 9:30 a.m. We're working again with ACC on the North Hill campus in Brandon. So I actually think this morning, just as we were starting, I think I got a first look at the poster. I won't be able to send it out till, I'll get it approved and we'll get it sent out. So watch for that. There'll be a poster out soon on that. And basically, this is the Weed Seedling ID Day that historically had been in Carmen, but we now are working with ACC, and they've got a really nice weed garden where they've got some perennials and some biennials, and then they plant some annuals every year. We've got a really good system up there and using their greenhouses and the weed garden up on the North Hill campus in Brandon. So there'll be a little bit more information coming forward, but normally we start the day, I'll do some talk on weed ID and that type of thing. And then after that, we just move to the weed garden, and you're welcome to stay there as long as you like. There's a bit of a quiz, I guess, but it's just more for, to kind of kick off the spring for weed ID. And so there'll be a presentation, and then there'll actually be lots of live specimens to look at as well.
What I liked about it last time I was there is he was able to take a lot of pictures, and then you got the weed picture, and you got the name right in front of you. So then you can almost make your own little library for yourself. So
Right. And I will give a plug. I actually use I use a few apps, and that's something too maybe we could talk about another time. But lots of times I use, like, I have an Apple, I have an iPhone, and I use Google Lens. Lots of times if you take a picture and there's a little mark on it or a little eye on it. And if you're taking a picture of a weed, it is not great on really small weeds, I will say that. But once weeds get a little bit bigger, it's surprisingly accurate. Lots of times if you take a picture of a weed with enough identifying features on it, it's pretty close. So even just using your iPhone and using that Google Lens, I think it's called, that actually works surprisingly well. So I would encourage people to start looking at that too. Gets you close. If it doesn't get it bang on, it gets you pretty close, narrows out a lot, narrows it down. So that's another thing now that we all are using our phones in the field and taking pictures, that's something too. When you take a picture of a weed, just see if that's helpful to you, because I'm finding I use it a lot.
yeah, really good point. I used it when we did the weed survey quite a bit. So that was good.
Yeah.
Great, good comment. Next one is for Ann Kirk, and this is going back to when I was talking about the winter wheat and talking about some of it being underwater for a long period of time. I thought it would be good if maybe Ann can maybe talk a little bit about how long winter wheat can survive and underwater, and what are some of the issues we need to worry about if it's gonna make it or not. So Ann, if you're on.
Yeah, I'm on here. Yeah, definitely a concern if crops are underwater for a long period of time. So the crop injury in this case would be from lack of oxygen. So, when soils are saturated, there's just not a lot of oxygen available to the roots of the plants. So there's two important factors. One would be the temperature. So the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of oxygen depletion in the soil, and the faster the crop will run out of oxygen. So it's definitely, if your crops are going to be underwater, it's definitely better to have your winter wheat or fall rye underwater very early in the season, where they're probably still dormant and the soil microbes aren't using up a lot of oxygen because the soils are still pretty cool. So in most cases, like in warm summer conditions, I think the rule of thumb would be 2 to 4 days. If your crops are underwater for 2 to 4 days, the amount of oxygen level would decrease to the point where it's harmful at that period. But at this time period, because it is a little bit cooler still at night, you could say 5 to 7 days, but you could still see yield impacts if that crop is trying to respire and there's no oxygen available in the soil. So winter wheat would definitely be expected to fare better in waterlogged conditions than fall rye, just because fall rye does tend to wake up a bit earlier and put on more growth earlier in the season. And I think if you're concerned about it, you could dig up some plants and see if there's some new white root growth, or if the lack of oxygen is impairing new root growth.
Okay, yeah, and that's I guess the question came up because of some of the water that pooled after some of the overland flooding, and then you get areas where it's just sitting and it doesn't look like it's going to be able to drain away. So that's where I think that question came from. And so in a lot of those cases, it's probably going to sit there for a while. So those areas. So how will you know, like, if when you see some of those areas in the field now, and it's the fields are greening up, and those areas got that brownish kind of green look to them in the field when you look across the field, Is that a sign that they might be dying off, or is that a sign that they might be growing through it?
Yeah, winter cereals are always so tough to tell because sometimes plants look dead and they're actually alive, and vice versa. Like a green plant isn't necessarily an indication that it's growing until you see active new leaf growth. So yeah, I think just digging up some plants and seeing if you see new root growth. You could see there's if the plants are underwater for a long period, you'd expect to have some yield loss just due to the plants not having that active growth for some time, and possibly some leaching or denitrification of nitrogen in the soil because of those flooded soils. But I think the best case would just be to either wait for some new top growth and to dig up plants to see if you see new roots coming. And you'll be able to see, like, it's pretty obvious when you dig up those plants if there are new roots because they are so white compared to the older roots that developed in the fall.
Yeah, and they should be pretty active right now with the temperatures we've been getting lately. So I would think you would be able to see them fairly easy.
Yeah. And I would say, like, if your plants are submerged for a week at this point in time, it probably wouldn't be a good situation. Like at that point, you'd be expecting to have some major crop loss in those submerged areas. And it would just depend how big those areas are, what you'd like to do with them.
Good. Thanks, Anne. Okay, just a few more slides here. Crop protection guides are available. They're at the Ag Service Centers, or if you're needing one or wanting multiple copies, you could contact one of your Ag Extension specialists and they can help you get that, or go to your Ag Service Center and they could help you as well. We had the environmental farm plan on a presentation last week with Joel Mazur, and it was a really informative session, and there are a lot of opportunities for producers to access some funding to do some projects on their farms. So definitely keep this in mind, because I know we're all busy out in the field, but I think we're going to be running into some deadlines for applications within the next month, or within the next month or so here. So definitely, if you're a producer, keep on top of it, or if you're working with producers, keep reminding them about this program, because I think there's some good funding available to do some work on your farm. The crop production extension specialist, there's our contact information. Our livestock specialist and their contact information. Getting closer to getting out to pasture maybe in a couple of weeks here, so there might be some questions regarding getting cattle ready for pasture. Our service centers, where they're located and their numbers. If you have questions, definitely give them a call. The hay listing, we're still seeing the odd person looking for some hay, as maybe we're getting off to a little bit slower growth on some of our pastures, and some people are still looking for hay. So if you're looking for hay, go to that site, or if you've got hay for sale. And join us next week for May 17th for Crop Talk. Thanks for attending.